Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for checking out this week's um, Life Group Online study guide. It's kind of the thing we're doing every week where I give you the leader portion so that you can work through the study on your own. We're continuing our series on parables, and this is week 5 of our parable study. And so we're thankful that you stuck with us this long. I'm going to encourage you, whether you're by yourself or with someone else working through this, that you stop for just a moment, pause the video, and pray together as we begin. Now, I want to talk for a moment about wedding celebrations. They come in all shapes and sizes. We've probably all been to very simple weddings and very extravagant ones. And so, as we begin, I want you to pause for just a moment and have a little bit of a discussion. That if you've been to maybe a more extravagant wedding, what elements point to that being extravagant? What kind of things stick out to you as extravagant? So I'll give you my example before you pause. If I see ice sculptures, that's pretty extravagant. So pause for just a moment and talk about what makes a wedding extravagant. Now, whatever kind of wedding it is, whether it is, whether you enjoy going or not, it's very nice to be invited. And I really think that's true of anything that's invitation only. That when somebody goes through the thought process of who they should invite to something like a wedding or some other gathering, that they would take the time to consider you worthy of being invited. That means something. I want you to imagine for a moment getting an invitation to a very exclusive party. And you can think of whoever you want as the party host, but whoever you would consider prominent. An invitation that maybe you'd be surprised or honored to receive. Could be a celebrity, could be the president, could be the CEO of your company, it could be any number of people. But it's amazing to get that invitation. And so what I want you to imagine is what it might take for you to decline that invitation. Give that some thought for just a moment. Is there a reason that you would decline? Pause for just a moment and discuss. I would suggest that even if you had to decline, I can guarantee that you would do so in a graceful, grateful kind of way, that you would be apologetic, that you would be gracious, that you would be thankful for the invitation even coming. I don't think any of us would respond harshly to being invited to a gathering like that. But today in our parable, we'll read about a different response. Now, before we dive in, I want to give you a reminder about parables themselves and about our context. Much in the same way that last week's parable got a little bit intense with murders occurring, this week's parable also escalates to a level of violence that seems unrealistic given the particular situation that the story is describing. But again, these are parables, not true stories. So I want to share with you what France said in his commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. He said, "If the story verges on the absurd, why not? It is, after all, a parable, not a sober historical narrative. And parables are designed to convey lessons, not to be mirrors of life." I find that so interesting because to me what that means is if a parable seems out of bounds, if it seems absurd, then that must mean that Jesus felt like it needed to seem absurd in order to properly and effectively communicate the truth that he was trying to communicate to his listeners. And so if something seems unlikely, maybe we should pay attention to that piece of the puzzle. Now, our context today doesn't need a big explanation because it appears that this parable was shared in a similar time or even at the same time as the one we studied last week was. And so I will note there's a similar parable recorded in Luke where Jesus responds to the comment of a person at an actual banquet with this parable. But in either case, I think we can see this particular parable as being told with both a general crowd present, a mixture of believers and unbelievers, but also we can assume that the religious leaders were still close enough by to hear what Jesus was saying. And so we want to begin by reading Matthew chapter 22, beginning in verses 1 through 3. Pause for just a moment and read. Now, I want us to understand a little bit about the custom of that day. The listeners would have understood, those listening to Jesus tell the story, would have understood a wedding banquet like this to include 2 invitations. One invitation was to let them know that the wedding banquet was coming. The second invitation was to actually specifically let them know that it was ready for them to be there, that basically the food was ready in a lot of ways. And so when they refused to come, It's not like we could say, well, I'm busy at this moment and you just let me know kind of refusal. This was a legitimate refusal, and to refuse a king's invitation was unheard of. Now I want you to pause again and read verses 4 through 6. Pause for just a moment. There are a number of surprising developments here. Pause for a moment and discuss what those are. Pause for just a moment. I would point out that, number one, the king was restrained enough to send servants again to kind of re-invite, to further that message. Hey, by the way, I don't know if you caught this, but the food is ready. It's time to come. That he had the willingness to do that after he was insulted is surprising. And then the fact that the guests ignored even with the additional invitation, and that the escalation went to insults and even physical response with someone being killed. That's just, it's surprising. It seems absurd. But again, if it's part of the story, it must matter to what we're supposed to learn. Pause for just a moment and read verses 7 and 8. Now, can we blame the king for his response? I mean, it may have seemed extreme, but they escalated their rejection and he escalated his response. Now, what made the previously invited guests no longer worthy of the honor, as the king stated it? What specifically led to them being no longer worthy of the honor? Pause for just a moment. I would say, to boil it down, their response is what made that change from invited to no longer worthy of being invited. Now pause for just a moment and read verses 9 and 10. What jumps out to you about this new plan to invite folks to the wedding? And what might have been offensive about this development to the religious leaders present? Pause for just a moment and discuss. I would suggest, number one, it's interesting that both good and bad were invited, and that same detail is probably what drove the religious leaders nuts for Jesus to suggest that all were welcome, that all were invited, was probably offensive to them because they enjoyed the power that they had, and they wielded it in unfair ways at times. We see that throughout Scripture. And so for Jesus to suggest that, it was a little bit extreme. Pause it for a moment and read verses 11 through 14. Now, it's likely that we've been able to follow up to this point what Jesus is saying in this parable, because this story is not unlike the previous parable we studied. In the parable of the tenants, or the parable of the evil farmers we studied last week, the farmers were unworthy of the position that they were given, and so they were replaced. They had, full reign of the farm, but they were not worthy of that in the way that they treated the servants. And so in today's story, again, the original invitees to the wedding were not worthy of the position they were given at the wedding banquet, and so others were invited in their place. I think that's pretty clear to us. But what of this man? What do you think about what happened to this man? Why was he removed? And where was he removed to? Pause for just a moment and discuss. I would suggest that this man is a curveball to the whole story, but it's an important piece of the story. He was found to not be wearing the wedding clothes. Now, something you may not know about weddings in that time, wedding clothes were actually provided by the host. And the idea was that by providing wedding clothes, everybody would essentially wear the same thing. Their other clothes, their normal clothes, would be covered up, and it removed kind of the class distinction among people. And so everyone at the wedding banquet was seen as equal. So when this man doesn't have the wedding clothes on, we don't necessarily know that he's holding on to his status, but he's not falling in line with the customs. He's not doing what the king would have asked to do as the host, for him to put on the clothes. And so he was bound and thrown out into the darkness where there was weeping and gnashing of teeth. And I'll give you something here that you may already know. When you read the words weeping and gnashing of teeth in Scripture, it is never a good thing. We're typically talking about hell. And so we might find this a little bit confusing. We say, well, all are welcome, but some are still going to hell. That's really not the phrasing we want to use for how we understand this. I want you to stop for just a second and talk about or think about what Jesus was trying to communicate through the entire parable, and specifically through the seemingly confusing ending. What was Jesus trying to communicate to his listeners then? Pause for just a moment. I would suggest that the original invitees despising their invitation is just like the religious leaders rejecting the prophets, and specifically rejecting Jesus. And while all are invited to come, all are welcome, there are still expectations for those who accept the invitation to put on the wedding clothes, to put on Christ, to put on his righteousness, to live as he's asked us to live. So the question becomes, what's our takeaway? What can we learn from this parable? Pause for just a moment and discuss. This is a parable I would go to when somebody teaches any kind of idea that once you come to Jesus, you can just live however you want to, do whatever you want to, and there are no consequences, there are no expectations. That's simply not what Scripture says, and it's certainly not what Jesus teaches in this parable. I've heard it said this way: for Christians, sometimes we desire to have God on our own terms. We have accepted the invitation to the banquet, but we don't want to change our clothes or our behavior. We want God to conform to our desires instead of the other way around. You see, ultimately, we understand that there will be some who accept God's invitation with their lips, but reject it with their actions. And so I think for us, this becomes a question of, have we accepted the invitation with our lips? Have our actions back that up? And how can we help others walk through that same question in their own life and say, does something need to change for me? Does my action need to more line up with lips? Because the truth is, one thing about this parable is you see it in this short time frame of a wedding banquet. But the weeping and gnashing of teeth, the thrown out into the darkness, I think we can see that more associated with the final judgment. And so we have time, but if a change needs to be made and our actions need to fall more in line with our lips who say we follow Jesus, it's time to make that change. It's a deep parable when you start diving into it, but hopefully we've all learned a little something. I want to challenge you to close your time in prayer, and I'm going to pray for you before we finish the video. God, we're thankful for another opportunity to study your word. We're thankful for these parables and all that we've learned from them, and I pray that we would continue to be students of your word, not just in these times and not just on Sunday mornings, but daily, God, that we're diving into your word. And God, I pray that our actions would match what our lips have said when we've said we were going to follow Jesus. And so God, give us the boldness to follow with our lives, not just with our words. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thanks, everybody.